I'd like to add the ability to see other users in the system in a list down here. And then when we click on a user, to be able to go to that user's to-do page. And the reason for that is I'd like to be able to comment on other people's tasks. We're going to move pretty quickly through building this feature since you should already understand the concepts now. So we're just going to work through the workflow and add a couple new ideas to what we've seen already. So to start off, let's build the scaffolding using the scaffolding tool. And then we'll go and fill in each of the template, publish function, and controller and route. So what we'll start off by doing is coming down here and we'll say iron generate, and we'll start off with the route. And so the route is going to be for a particular user. So we'll say users ID. And so this will be the route that we go to when we click on a particular user, a link in the list here. And we'll call this users detail, and we'll change the controller to users controller, which we'll fill in a sec. And the action will be the detail action. All right, next let's generate the controller. So we'll generate a controller resource called user. And then we'll go up here and make sure that that actually got created. Great, so we have a user's controller. And we'll generate a couple of templates. The first template will be the users list, which we're going to show on the home page. So I'm going to create a new folder called users, and within that folder we'll create a template called users list. And then we need a template for the details of the user, so we'll call this users detail. And the rest of the templates will update. The rest of the templates already exist. We'll just go ahead and update them. Then we need to create a new publish function. So I'm going to say iron generate publish. And for this, we need to be able to publish out some users. So I'm going to create a publish function called users, and then another publish function called user, singular, because we're going to get a particular user and all of that user's to-dos. All right, and if we come up here, let's make sure that the publish functions got created for us. Great, so we have a publish function called users and another one called user. We'll fill those in a bit. I've opened up our home template where we're rendering out the to-dos list, and I'm going to add another template here. We're going to render out the users list, and this is a template that we just created, so we should see the find me in boilerplate HTML there. Great. Now we can go over to that template and start filling it in. So you can go into the templates folder, into the users folder that we created, and pull up the users list. So we're going to iterate over a list of users here. So we'll use the each iterator. And for each user, we'll go ahead and print out their login name. So I'm going to say the profile name. And we want to link to the user. And the route will be the one that we just created. So the route name will be users.detail. And that will go ahead and create the link for us automatically. All right, now so far we're not getting any users, and that's because we don't have any data here, and we can confirm that by coming down into the console and typing meteor users find and then fetch to get an array. So the only object here should be the logged in user, which is our user account. So we want to be able to get all the users here so that we can list them. So let's do that first, and then we'll fill in the helpers for this users list. So the place to subscribe, which is where we'll start, is the home controller. So pull up the home controller, and so far we're just subscribing to our own to-dos, but we'll add a subscription here for users. Next up, let's go to the publish function, or the publish JS file, and fill in this users query. What we'll do is we'll return a cursor for all the users, but let's not publish out all the private data. So we want to just specify the fields that we want to publish, and for now I'm just going to publish out the profile. And it looks like I've got a syntax error. There we go. Okay, once we fix the syntax error and refresh here, let's make sure that we're getting the data. So again, I'm going to do a find fetch on the users collection, and we have to debug this a little bit to make sure that we're getting the data that we expect to get. Now the problem is that we're likely getting an error here because there's no such thing as users. It's actually Meteor users. So whenever you're getting some kind of problem where you're not getting the expected result, check the server tab and make sure that you don't have an exception. And here's the exception we're seeing here saying users is not defined. So we can fix that really easily. We'll just say meteor.users and then pop over to this tab and make sure that we're not getting an exception. And we'll run that query again. And now we have the two users that we expect. So we have our own logged in user and the other user in the system, which is Evented Mind. Okay, next up, we actually need to list the users on the page. Notice the users area over here is blank, and that's because we haven't created the helper yet. So if we go to users list, let's keep that open for reference and then open up another window below it so we can see the helper file for this. So we'll see userslist.js. And we need to create the helpers function called users. So this function is going to return a cursor for all the users that are not the currently logged in user. There's no sense in showing a link to my own account. So we'll return Meteor users find, and we'll look for all users where the ID is not mine. So we'll say use the not equals query and say not equal to the currently logged in user. Okay, when we do that, the user interface should update and we see the Evented Mind user in the list there. And we should be able to click on the Evented Mind user and we'll get an exception because we haven't created the detail handler yet. But the link exists, and if we investigate the link by looking at inspect element, you can see it has the ID for the correct user. So next up, we need to go and create the functionality for this page and this route. I've opened up the user's controller, and let's fill in this functionality now. We're going to rename the action function to the details function because that's what we said in our route, that this was going to be the function for this particular route. And instead of rendering something called users, let's render something called users detail. Now, in order to get the data for the user, we're going to have to subscribe to a new publish function. We'll call it user. And this time we're going to pass up a parameter. We're going to pass up the ID for the user, and we can get that from the URL under the params object. And then for our global data context, we're going to return the particular user from the users collection. So I'll say Meteor users find one, and we'll find the one where the ID is equal to, again, the ID that we get from the URL. So this.params._ID. Okay, and then we'll get rid of these comments. Those are just there to be helpful to you. All right, now we should be able to click on the Evented Mind link, and that should take us to the user's detail page. And it looks like we have an exception here. It says no method named detail found on handler. So let's look up our routes file. And it looks like the action is called detail, not details. So I'll get rid of this S. And we'll try this one more time. Great. So now we're on the user's detail page and we're seeing the boilerplate HTML that we need to fill in next. Next up, let's update our publish functions so that we can get this new data that we need. So we'll start off down at the bottom in the user publish function. Now this is actually going to take a parameter, so it's going to take the parameter user ID. And we're going to do something a little differently here. We want to actually publish out two things. We want to publish out the information for the particular user, but we also want to get that user's to-dos. The way we can do that is by returning an array of cursors, and then Meteor will know automatically to publish out all the cursors in the array. So we'll start off by publishing out the cursor for the particular user, so the user where the ID is equal to the one that was passed up. And the second cursor will be all the to-dos for that particular user. Now I want to make one other change here, which is when we land on a particular to-do, I want the breadcrumb to show the particular user that it belongs to. So I'm going to do the same thing to this publish function and return an array. And we're going to return the user for the to-do. But since we don't have a user ID that's sent up here, we need to do a little trick. We're going to grab the to-do item by saying to-dos find one. And then we're going to find the user where the ID is equal to the to-do user ID. And we'll publish out both of these cursors. So this will work so long as the user of the to-do doesn't change. And if it doesn't, we'll still get the real-time functionality. Okay, so we should be all done with our publish functions. To test if this is working, come down to the console on the right and run a query for all the users. And we should have 2 records now because there's 2 user records in the database. Now, one thing I'm noticing here is there's more fields on this user than we really want. Notice that we're publishing out all the private fields as well, including the login tokens and Meteor developer authentication account and access token. So we don't want to publish all that stuff out. We really just want to publish the ID and the public profile for the user. So let's come in and modify our publish function a little bit. And we'll specify that we want to just publish out the profile. So just like we did above. And we need to do the same thing up here. And once that updates, we should be able to come over and we should just be getting the data that we need. Okay, our data is looking good, so let's go in and fill in these templates. All right, I've opened up the user detail template and its corresponding JavaScript file below. Let's get rid of the boilerplate, and I'm going to paste in some HTML here, which I'll walk you through. The first thing to note are the breadcrumbs content for block. This is going to put this content into the layouts breadcrumbs area like we saw earlier. And what I want to show here in this breadcrumb is the profile name of the user that we're looking at. Then down below, I've created some paneling for the to-dos list, and we'll iterate over a list of to-dos for the user, and again show the to-dos detail link for the particular to-do. Now, since we're looking at someone else's to-dos, I'm not going to show the create text box or the completion checkbox for the to-do. It's just going to be a read-only list. So when I click save here, we should see the UI change a little bit, but we still have to go and fill in these helpers. So let's add a to-dos function helper. And this helper will return a list of to-dos, or a cursor for a list of to-dos, where the user ID is equal to the current user. So the data context for this template is the user. So we're going to say that this is the current user. Sometimes it gets confusing to remember what the data context is, and so I like to assign it to a variable that reminds other developers what it's for, or what the data context is. So in this case, it's user. So we'll say that we want to find the to-dos where the user ID is equal to the user's ID. And we'll go ahead and sort that by the created at date in descending order. So the newest tasks get put up on top. Great, so now we're seeing evented mined tasks or to-dos. All right, I've pulled up the to-dos detail template so that we can start modifying that a bit. If I click on one of these to-dos, the thing I want to change is at the top, the breadcrumbs area isn't showing the title of the to-do, and it's also not showing the user. So let's update the breadcrumbs here. I'm going to paste in some HTML and walk through it. So again, we're going to use a content for block here for the breadcrumbs area of the layout. And we'll start off by saying, if this is my to-do, then don't show any link here. But if it's someone else's, then go ahead and show a link to the user's profile. Then in this link to block, we're specifying the user's detail route, but also providing the ID manually for the data context. So you can do that in using the link to helper. We can say that the ID is equal to specifically this user's ID. And we'll add this as a helper in a sec. And then we have the subject of the to-do as the active breadcrumb. Okay, so next up, what we need to do is to go add this helper for the user. I've opened up the to-dos details JavaScript file down below, and we'll add a helper here called user, and this will return the user document for the current task or the current to-do. Again, just to make it easier for other developers to know what the data context is, I'll create a variable called to-do and assign it to this, since that is the current data context. Then let's find the user where the user's ID is equal to the to-do's user ID. And once the page refreshes, we should see now that the user is showing up in the breadcrumbs along with the subject. And if we click on the user, that should take us back to the user's tasks. And just to make sure that it's working, if I click on one of my own tasks, the user profile doesn't show, the user profile name doesn't show here, and instead we just see the subject of my own task. Great, so now we have the ability to look at multiple users' tasks. And if you want to try out multiple user accounts, one thing you can do is to open up an anonymous browser session and go to localhost on the anonymous browser session and log in with a different account. So this will bring up the Meteor login dialog, and you can just sign in with a different account, and that'll let you try things out.